Yeah, a little late. Good evening, everybody. I'm Gary Sandling. I'm the vice president here at Monticello. There we go. The vice president here at Monticello and the chief content officer. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this in-person, which we haven't had very many of, right? In-person outdoor event for a very special occasion. Yeah. And to celebrate the achievement of our special guest, of course, and in her debut book, a very thought-provoking and vividly imagined collection. And I've had the privilege and responsibility of working here for 16 years, and I've seen firsthand, in a lot of circumstances, the many different meanings that Monticello holds for a lot of people. And those meanings are varied, and they are not just analytical or intellectual, they can be emotional, and they can be very powerfully experienced. And Miss Johnson herself, has noted that Monticello is a symbol of the past. It's a symbol of America's promise. It's a symbol of the founding fathers. It's a symbol also of slavery, racism, and brutality. And it was also a place lived in by dozens and dozens of very real people with real lives and real stories. And those stories tell us about our past and help us understand our present. And Miss Johnson's work, even though it's a work of fiction, arguably because it is a work of fiction, more powerfully holds messages for us of warnings and of hope for our future. It's a formidable book, and it bears witness to this country's legacies and announces a really just also original new voice in American fiction. Hey, that's her, yeah. I think all I can really say about that is if you have a blurb from Colson Whitehead that calls your book a badass debut by any measure, I love that. Nimble, knowing, and electrifying. That's pretty good stuff. So it's my privilege to welcome Jocelyn Johnson to Monticello to talk to us tonight about her book. So thank you for being here tonight. And joining her is Andrew Davenport. To my left, Andrew is the public historian and manager of the Getting Word African American Oral History Project, a project that has been in process for almost 30 years, documenting stories and interviews of descendants of enslaved families at Monticello, who are the truth tellers of their family's history and its role in our common history. And so tonight, I know we'll hear a reading from Ms. Johnson and conversation between Andrew and the author. And we want to make good use of all that time. So we won't have a formal question and answer session. We're going to sort of fill all that space, let them fill all that space tonight. So join me in welcoming them. Thanks.
So, can you all hear me?
Is this thing on? We're going to get there. Almost. There we go. You're on too, I think.
So, can you all hear me now? I'll try again. Now I hear my echo. I think you can hear me. I'm going to, first of all, thank you so much for coming out. It really means a lot to see faces that I recognize and some new faces as well. It really means a lot. I'm going to start just by reading a short excerpt from the novella. So my Monticello is 5 stories, and then the novella, which takes up the majority of the book, is named after the place that we are. I really wanted to read from the beginning of novella, and what you need to know about what I'm going to read is that the story of my Monticello is the story of a diverse group of Charlottesville neighbors in a kind of near future that could be now, almost, a very familiar near future, in a time of unraveling, where things have fallen apart. And this group of neighbors has, sorry, my hair is on the mic. This group of neighbors is forced to flee their homes on First Street, which is in the neighborhood where I live, when violent white supremacists attack their homes. And if you live in Charlottesville, you know what a jaunt bus is. They go on a jaunt bus. They drive the route that I drove tonight to get here, and they end up taking refuge here at Monticello, starting in this welcome pavilion where we're sitting right now, and eventually going up to the house. And they're led by an imagined descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who's a young woman who's a college student at UVA. So I'm going to read the very first paragraph, and then I'm going to skip forward just a little bit and read their drive up to Monticello, because I just thought it would be interesting, since we're sitting here, for you to hear that and just hear a little bit of who these people are. My Monticello. We claimed it first, this little mountain. Me and Ma Violet and a scattering of neighbors, all of us fleeing First Street after men came and set our row of tin-roofed homes on fire. The men came at dusk, blaring an operatic, "Oh, say, can you see?" White heads rose up from dusty jeeps, and dark hair thrashed in a harsh new wind like tattered flags. "Ours," the men shouted. Their rifles gleamed as if they'd only just been bought, a megastore militia. Through the haste Violet's blinds, I even saw a boy among them, blond and sneering in a pickup window. From back seats, sprang out of truck beds and rushed towards our homes. White hands clutched metal canisters, swung torches spilling flames. Bright shouts, the rising haze of smoke, all that and more rousted us out. From our patchy front yards, we saw bodies blur as some of our neighbors charged forward to try to stop them. We saw a teen struck with the butt of a rifle, his temple spraying red. A toddler flailed, diapered and clinging to its mother's hip as she sank knees first to the sidewalk. What we saw in those moments riveted us, and then it set us free. Skip ahead a little bit. Fleeing First Street in the jaunt, we barreled by Brown's Corner Store with its sabotaged pumps and boarded up windows. We veered at a blighted traffic light and rolled down a long, sagging road past small, once cheerful-looking dwellings. By then, those houses stood battered and grim-faced, ringed and waist-high lawns. Behind me, someone said, "You cut?" Someone else said, "Everybody all right?" Then folks' voices began to surge with new panic. "Is that them? Oh God, they're still coming. Drive." It was true. In the side view mirror, I could see an inky Jeep was gaining speed behind us. More men and the same, closing the distance. And what would they do when they reached us? What should we do? Fresh cries floated up the aisle, but for a moment, all meaning of words was lost on me. A deep ringing invaded my head. I spun the wheel right at an intersection, but the Jeep turned too, trailing at a distance. Now we were heading south towards the edge of town. "Lord, what is happening?" I heard Ma Violet say. I did not know where we were going. I only knew I meant to get us all away. I might have taken the exit for the highway, except a lone man was pacing its slanted mouth. Behind us, the Jeep screeched to a stop, straddling both lanes as if there were an invisible line drawn. I kept straight, my pulse wild in my throat as our hometown shrank and cowered behind us. The voices in the bus went silent again, and in their absence, I could hear the shush of tires gripping, an unsteady rumble as we treaded fallen branches. In the rear view, Ma Violet worried the yoke of her housecoat, her face caught in waning copper light. I drove past the community college where I used to go, tucked into rolling hills. We were fast approaching the rise of the Piedmont Mountains, where the road slid between the shadows of trees. At the last failed streetlight, I swung us left, if only to disappear that specter of that oil-black Jeep, still spun out across the road. I did not know that I would bring us here. not even as we passed the steep drive up to the orchard, or slowed at the curve near the old-timey general store with its dark planked walls and massive wheel of the mill clinging to one side. Across a parking lot, a plantation house turned tavern shone white with black shuttered windows. I kept on, following the slender tree-lined route, rounding a set of S-curves pulled forward as if by gravitation. The jaunt, squat and heavy, skidded towards the edge of the road like we might tumble into the trees. It was only when I saw Monticello's stone-faced bridge, lucent in the twilight, that's when I understood. Yeah.
Well, Jocelyn, thanks so much for reading from your wonderful book and to congratulate you on such a wonderful critical and popular reception of the collection. And it is a distinct honor to be with you and a distinct honor to be with all of you and in this place where Denasia did not realize she was bringing us to, but we are all here together. And so I'd like to open by asking you, Jocelyn, one of Ma Violet, Denasia's grandmother's favorite questions, and that is, have you found joy? What have you found joyful today?
So in this story, the main character, Denasia Love, is a college student, and her main caretaker is her grandmother, Ma Violet, whom she cares about very much, and that's Ma Violet's way of just checking in with her granddaughter. And for me personally, it was a way to bring the story back around to and keep within the story the idea of joy, because it's got some dark parts for sure, as you've heard from what I read at the beginning. And for me, it's a distinct joy that I wrote something that anyone cares about. I've been writing a really long time, and when you're an artist and when you make things, even when you make beautiful things, often people don't notice or you don't get to hear from them. So it's really nice when sometimes you do.
Great.
So.
And as your characters write in the lawn of Monticello, we are here. What does it mean for you today to be here?
So for me, I have to say, it's nice my parents are sitting here, that it has a little bit of that quality of closing a loop. I've been to Monticello. I've lived in Charlottesville for 20 years, a little longer than 20 years. And I've come up here with family members. You know, when someone comes out of town, I've come with my husband when he was doing photography for something. And it's a really beautiful place, and I've enjoyed it. But there is, for me, as a Black American and as a woman and just as myself, the person that I am, there's a little bit of distance and a little bit of caution with how I approach being here and how I think about this place. And so it's interesting to be invited here, right, to be able to speak to you. Also, you know, I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic. I don't even have an MFA. I am a writer. I've been a public school teacher for 20 years in Virginia. And what I wanted to do in this story and what I was interested in this story was creating a fictional place where I could center characters that maybe I related to in some way, that maybe looked like me in some way, that had some similar qualities to me, that came from my neighborhood, that embodied some of the things I think are really important about this country, and let them have access to this place in a different way, and let them claim it. And so even though the story is not the easiest story, there's a quality of a night in the museum for me where you get to touch all the things and they get to be yours and you get to really claim them, which wasn't my experience of Monticello, but in writing the book, it was a little bit more. There was something really nice about it. And certainly to have Monticello just carry the book and just be here with you all and be here with people I recognize from other parts of my life, from being a teacher and so forth. It's lovely. So I'm really glad to be here.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And you mentioned being a public school teacher, and I'd be curious to hear what your experience is as a public school art teacher, how that helped form you as a person and as an artist. And did you find yourself following the advice that you oftentimes would have given to your elementary school students?
It's so much harder when you're doing.
Right. That's right.
I think I say be brave and write what you want to write, and then as soon as you've worked so hard to get your work in the world, and then as soon as it was, I was like to my husband, I'm like, I don't know about this. This seems strange. and having people, because the book locally has gotten so much attention, like someone drove by me today in their car and just like stopped on the road and was like, I'm almost done with the audiobook, and I didn't know this person at all. But being a teacher is really, well, first of all, I love anyone whose children I've taught knows I really love teaching, and it's a really huge part of my life. And especially in the novella, but even in the other stories, I really drew on teaching a lot, both for just inspiration about how people are, right? You just have this like group of diverse people that are just in your charge. Lord knows why that happens. And then you're like, you just get all these little insights into kind of the human condition like all day long. So that's really helpful as a writer. Another thing is the character Denasia Love in the novella is studying to be a teacher. She's studying to be an educator. So I really used things I care about and believe in the experiment of public education, of public spaces that are supported to kind of scaffold how she's going to get this diverse group of neighbors to work together and to be a community. So at one point in the story, while they're still down here, they're kind of infighting and they're trying to figure out how to survive. And they kind of form this circle, and she kind of has them write what they call a hasty constitution, which is basically what teachers do at the beginning of every school year, where they say, what are we willing to do for one another? How can we manage to be a community even though we're different? And how can we get buy-in from all the different individuals here? So I really drew on that to try to imagine how I could get these people to become a kind of family with one another.
It reminds me of having been a teacher myself and starting out the school year with those hasty constitutions and all those resolutions as well. Having students sign syllabuses and return it and read it all over. That's exactly what Denasia Love was doing. And it reminds me that she says that she's interested in giving back, giving something to somebody, just as she had received in turn. And thank you for writing that. You've received some attention for being a debut fiction writer in this collection. You've also talked quite a bit about failure and rejection and persistence. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've persisted and what gave you strength and succor through the years as an artist.
I mean, I think it's true. I mean, I do think there's a way in which, like, my partner knows, my parents know, like, if you're a person who wants to make things, you're probably gonna make things, but you still want like some external validation as you go through things. And it doesn't have to be a blurb from Colson Whitehead, even though that's amazing. It can be just having a story accepted in a small journal, and like those are all things that I worked really hard for over time. But I also think there's just what's nice about having. So I've had like several books go out on submission and not be picked up, and I've had like a really long, periods where it almost went out and people are excited about it and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. I'm really glad this is my debut. I feel like this was the right debut, and I think that the things that I did in the past were folded into this in a lot of ways. It was a nice way that I could pull from ideas that were important and was able to refine them, and I feel like they're contained in a way in this. But also I was gonna keep going because I just like making things and I like writing stories, and I had smaller communities that were listening and so forth. And I think that, that's all. I think it's really good just to not be outcome driven and be more driven by what you want to do and what you want to say, and you're probably going to be happy with it. And when I will say, when I got to this collection, like short stories aren't really sellable apparently. That's what I've been told many times. And so, but I knew what I wanted to do because I had done all these other things. I had more of a sense of this is what I want to do, and I want to find partners who are interested in this, as opposed to trying to chase the idea of being published. I just knew that this is what I wanted to do, and in this case, luck and the work and all the things came together in a way that made it work out really nicely. so far.
Thank you. And I know that we'll talk probably pretty extensively, given where we are, about the novella, My Monticello. But while we have a few moments, would you mind describing these other, I think it's 5 other stories in the collection, just for everyone's benefit?
Sure. So I won't give you a synopsis of every story, but so there's 5 other stories that lead up to the novella. They're all set in Virginia. I was born in Virginia. This is definitely, it's where I grew up in Northern Virginia. I went to school in the Shenandoah Valley at James Madison University. I have lived in Charlottesville for 20 years, and I've taught in Arlington and other places in Virginia. And so one of the big themes for me in all of the stories was this idea of home and how Virginia is, in this way, unequivocally my home. It's just a state. I live here. This is where I live. There's something very satisfying about that, right? You don't have to, there's nothing special. There's no litmus test. And yet there was this way in which I didn't always feel completely at home. And so I think that was brought really into sharp relief for me with recent events, included but not limited to August 12th here in Charlottesville, where we had the Unite the Right, the whole summer of hate leading up to, if you lived here, it wasn't just like a day, but the anticipation, the experience of that, and then the aftermath. And so the stories for me were an exploration of this idea of home, longing for home, who gets to belong, what does it mean to not belong, both for those who do belong and those who are outside of it? What is the cost of excluding people? And so I have the initial story in the collection. It's called Control Negro, which is, again, a story inspired by local events. If you all were here in 2015 in Charlottesville, a young man, a UVA student, Martise Johnson, was bloodied by uniformed officers right along the strip, and it was caught on tape. And that experience, at this time, my son was much younger, but having a son and thinking about how do you protect your children? So it's a story, it's a Frankenstein-like story, a very twisted story about a father who's a professor who is testing America's promise. He's testing the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Could it apply to someone like him? So a Black kid, if he only can make his kid this kind of perfect example. I think he says, if he made him so blameless that America couldn't see fault in this child unless we as a nation had projected it there. So it's this idea of thinking about those. And then there's a variety of stories told in kind of all different forms. There's a story with students, young children, like a chorus of boys. There's a story called Virginia's Not Your Home, which used to be the title of the collection before it became My Monticello. And there's a story in the form of a list called Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse, which I wrote before the pandemic, but really speaks to that idea of feeling like things are falling apart, and maybe they really are, but still wanting to invest in the future and still wanting to have nice hair and still wanting nice things, but just trying to manage all those different things together. So, and lastly, there's a story, The King of Zandria, that is a story of an immigrant father coming from Nigeria to Alexandria. It's called the King of Zandria, and his son's name is Alex, so he thinks this place is named after his son. He's trying to navigate this experience.
Thank you. And Jocelyn, you've spoken about how your work is very much about the idea of Virginia, and of course, My Monticello notes on the state of Virginia plays such a significant role in that novella. And actually, as you're speaking, I'm realizing that it plays a role across these stories, and it weaves in and out. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you repurposed Notes on the State of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's text from 1785 became one of the most read books of the 19th century, and incredibly influential for all sorts of reasons, including, of course, Jefferson's expressed his own racism there, and scientific racism at that. So would you talk to us about how you recontextualize Notes on the State of Virginia for your own artistic purposes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just say I read Notes on the State of Virginia on my Kindle, little by little at night. I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian, but it was interesting to think about this text that was such a nice window into Thomas Jefferson's thinking. And also Virginia, right? So there's this way that I already knew by the time I read that I was thinking about Virginia. And in this text, he's really talking about like the physical land, like the height of the mountains, the width of the lakes, trying to label and list things, which I love a list, like I love a list. And then he also has these like observations about Native peoples, about, you know, Black people and so forth. So one thing I thought was interesting is as I was writing the novella, My Monticello, I really like thinking about form and how you're going to shape a story. So as Danasia's writing the story, the narrator of My Monticello, it's almost like she's writing a journal in the days. You know, you feel like you're really hearing the account from her. And I wanted to use kind of the form that Jefferson used, the way that he organized his piece, the way that it was formatted. And then just pulling his ideas from his own words. I just think it's a fair way to portray someone. And so I tried to put, I think I say, his limits right next to his hope and his promise in the story in a way that was fair. I mean, one thing I really think about is the book is not so much about Jefferson. It's more about bringing the same humanity and the same care to the other people who also call this place home, and giving them the same consideration for their talents and their hopes against just their humanity and all the other things that we all are. So that was something I was really thinking about.
Thank you. And where did you draw inspiration from for the novella itself?
So for the novella, certainly that piece was a direct reaction to August 12th, 2017 in Charlottesville. I wrote it about a year later, and I was thinking that whole time in the summer leading up to that and in the year after, what do we do with this? What does this mean? How do we respond to it? How should I respond to it? I was a school teacher. You know, I'm looking at students who are dealing with this. And then I don't know, if you've lived in this town, you might remember, I think in the year after, and especially on the 1-year anniversary, there were a lot of events about the history of Charlottesville in terms of race and equity. And so I was learning kind of a lot about Charlottesville that I hadn't known, even though it was right there in front of me. And so it led me in a kind of a line back to this long line just of brutality and violence towards Black and brown people that just went back to the founding fathers. I'll also say, I hope she doesn't mind, but I went to a talk at Common House in Charlottesville about an opera that was sung in the imagined voice of Sally Hemings. And so there was a panel, there was someone from the Jefferson School who came to this talk, there was the opera singer. I didn't go to the opera, I just went to the talk. I love hearing people talk about making stuff. I think that's really cool. So I went to this talk, and at the end of the talk, somebody introduced a person, a descendant, to stand up in the audience, and she's actually here tonight, which is Miss Colleen Yates right here. And so she stood up in the audience, and that was really interesting to me, to think about what would it mean living here now. It just brought an awareness to me that, you know, there are obviously, we all have a history, and it just brought it into sharp relief for me. And it really connected me to the idea of a story that would take place here. It kind of connected Monticello to this violent event that we'd had. And really in the novella, I'm just kind of trying to just nudge forward into the future just a little bit. And what would happen, I guess my question for it was, what would happen if this was allowed to fester and continue and was lauded, not just white supremacy or violent extremist white supremacy, but also just not taking care of our planet, not taking care of our infrastructure. Where would that leave people, and what would that mean? So this was my like cautionary tale of like what might happen if all that came together.
And you have the idea in your mind, and I'm sure you're writing it out, and you're obviously going on these research trips to Monticello. You've described your experiences coming to Monticello over the years. What was it like when you were looking at this place with now more attuned to your artist's eye? What were those visits like?
It made it more fun. It was really interesting to write it, I had a new purpose, like I had a secret purpose because no one knew I was doing it. So I'm going on these tours and I was able to, like I had my little notebook and I was like, oh, this is where blah, blah, blah is going to go, or someone's going to touch this, or that is the perfect room for this character. And so, it also gave me cause to, I took this out, the Hemmings family tour and the enslaved people's tour. And to be fair, in the time since I first came to Monticello many years ago to now, there are many more offerings that way. So Monticello has definitely expanded the story, and I was able to take advantage of hearing, more about descendants and seeing, the exhibit, the Sally Hemings exhibit underneath, the causeway and all those things. So it was really fun to do that. One thing also that I appreciated was that I didn't need to understand everything about Monticello historically. I only needed to understand it as my contemporary young character understood it. And it was really about, for me, I wanted to get the actual physicality of the place right, the objects right, and to understand the story as she would know it, which was through docents, which was through family stories, which was through, the objects that she could see. So that made it more fun as well, more interesting.
You must have felt like you were undercover, a detective searching out clues. Or I was talking to Gary Sandling a couple of days ago about how you even got, in the entrance hall, you even got on the guides' chairs, the string across the chairs. I thought that's such a wonderful detail that only an artist would see, and not just see but relate in poetry, really.
Well, because the chairs are blocked off, there's this strip across. And so in the story, the characters, part of their constitution and part of their idea of places, we're not going to destroy this place for the sake of, we're not here to harm it, but this is our temporary home and we're going to use these things. So they, the narrator slashes the chair for her grandmother to be able to sit in. So there's a sense of claiming it.
And speaking of Denaja's grandmother, Ma Violet, there's Denaja, of course. There's Ma Violet, her grandmother. There's Denaja's mother. I'm not sure has a first name. Is it just Mama?
Yeah, she just called her Mama.
You have these three characters, and they all have very different ways of relating to the past, and particularly their ancestral past, but also the past of this place, which is obviously overlaps. Could you talk about how those three characters triangulate around their relations to the past and how they inform one another's experiences? Of course, Denaja's mother has such difficulty in the classroom with her teacher, and her teacher dismisses her family history.
Yeah, so I definitely want, I didn't want to oversimplify how I could imagine how someone might feel as a descendant. So I have, in the story, Denaja's mom has disregard, doesn't want to talk about it, has this kind of wall around this idea of ancestry and Thomas Jefferson, and her grandmother has kind of, I think I say, a cautious regard for it. I actually marked a tiny, just like a paragraph. Do you mind if I read this little paragraph?
I would love that.
Hopefully it will actually work now, if I can see. So this is when the characters spend some time down here at the Welcome Pavilion, and eventually they're kind of called to come up. They go up. Move my hair off my head. I'm sorry. Go. Everything at the top of the hill felt new to me that morning, transfigured from the times I'd come before for school trips and for work. Before, there'd always been some measure of distance, a wall between whatever Monticello was and my real life. Real life was Mama, Ma Violet, my friends. Real life was school and my determination to do something that mattered, to do something for other people, especially people like the ones I'd grown up with, who were all too often undermined and undervalued. I'd kept my real life in one place and my imagined life of my ancestors in another unexamined place, like a room with no windows. Now my real life flailed and smoked behind me. Now this was my real life. Walking up, I felt myself seesawing again between density and lightness, between Mama's disavowal of that painful heritage and Ma Violet's cautious regard. So a big part of the story is how is this character going to reckon with and hopefully readers along with her, what it means. And spoiler, there's not like an easy answer, and I'm not saying I figured all that out, but she's definitely thinking about it, both in good ways and in difficult ways. What does this mean? What does this mean? I think at one point she says, will my neighbors think of me as more valuable or less valuable as a child of, or a descendant of a founding father and an enslaved person? Like, what does that mean to anyone? It doesn't matter. So that's a big question in the story.
And Denasia has to reckon with all of that and impending doom, the unraveling, and she seems to find strength in those stories and following her grandmother's example, at least cautious regard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Does Denasia speak to you as you're writing? Or do any of your characters kind of, are they really talkative in your ear, and do they jump out through your pen?
That's such a good question. I think it comes to me as I'm writing. It's really strange. I think as I'm writing, I'm like, oh, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. I definitely email myself a lot of sentences. And to be fair, I wrote all of these stories while teaching full time, and then in the summers I would go to workshops and so forth. So, it was like a project of determination. It probably drove my family crazy to finish it. And then during the beginning of the pandemic, when we were teaching from home, I was like, I'm going to finish this. I'm going to finish this and send it out there. And that's what I did.
You have such a mindful of time, and I'm also mindful that the ending of your story is completely unforgettable, and one of the best endings, I think, in recent memory. And would you mind, without giving anything away, talking to us about those meanings that accrue with that ending?
I think it was really important to me in thinking about inequity and racism and community and an environment, that I know stories that can be so fun and satisfying to have an ending where everything's resolved and where the hero wins. But I thought it would be silly to make a story where, 20-some people on a hill defeat white supremacy. I think that would not make sense. So instead of that, I'll say that there's some unresolved things in the ending, and that my goal and my hope and my intention was that it would leave readers, it would leave us thinking about what choices that we want to make and what we can do, big things and small things, to not, I can't say, there's people have been thinking about this and talking about this forever, people much smarter than me, but to at least put care into this, to think about repair, to think about reparation, to think about empathy, to acknowledge people's difficulties. I think the way that we think about, if you think about your own history, we know that the things that happened to us in the past, in our family life and our young life, affect us our whole lives. We all know that. Any adult knows that. And so for me, it was in some ways we're conscious of, in some ways that we're not. And so for me, this was almost an awakening, the writing of this, of how history around me that I may, in ways I may or may not be aware of, it's affecting, the way that we live now, and the choices we make now will affect what happens in the future as well. So I wanted to leave so I could relax a little, because I've put it on you all to think about these things that really worry me and keep me up at night.
It's up to us. Yeah. I'd like to end by asking a question we ask descendants in oral history interviews with the Getting Word Project. It's typically the last question that we ask, and that is, what would you like the world to know about your community and you and your family?
I don't know. I'm rooting for the outsider. I think there's something really, even though I talked a lot about how there's a way that I sometimes feel outside of things, I think it is a characteristic and a thing that I actually appreciate in myself. And I think it probably makes me a better writer and a better person and a better artist. Because I think when you're a little bit outside of something, you can look at it differently. You can talk about it differently. You can translate it a little bit. And so, I don't know, that's the thing I would like you to know about me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here, Jocelyn, and congratulations on such a fabulous debut collection of stories. And in honor of you and your accomplishments, on behalf of Monticello, we'd like to present to you this gift made from a hickory tree on the mountaintop. And this is for you to remember us by, and to remember this place by, and with acknowledgement that you've done so much to help us share stories as well. And again, congratulations to you.
Wow. Thank you.
Lovely
so
to
much.
meet you. And to our audience, thank you. Our vision at Monticello is to bring history forward and into the present to local and global audiences. And thank you for coming out on this wonderful October evening. It's fabulous to be with you. And thank you for being part of this honest and complicated and intimate conversation with all of us here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.